Sunil Khilnani in conversation with William Dalrymple for Incarnations, Reincarnations, presented by Aga Khan Foundation.
I hope you break into the chocolate. What's the money? What time is it?
Sorry? Oh, yeah. Sure. Sorry, just realizing.
So, ladies and gentlemen, if we could have the music now. Welcome, please, to Sunil Khilnani.
Thank you.
One of India's most distinguished modern historians, who landed, what I have to say, with some degree of envy and through gritted teeth, is the Dream BBC Commission to do for radio a complete history of India. And it's a massive project with 50 episodes.
There was a bit of nightmare in that dream as well, I can tell you.
What was the nightmare? Just having to take on so much unfamiliar territory along with,
the scale.
Because your area of expertise is Nehru, independence movement, mid-20th century.
Yeah, I mean, it was the scale of the project has been enormous, and I'm kind of amazed that I've actually got a book at the end of it. But yeah, I mean, the period that I knew, I guess, was the 20th century, late 19th, 20th century. And, one of the things that I wanted to do with this was to try and really understand the arc of Indian history. And so to get out of the usual professional area that people know, the 3 decades that they've done work on, or the one aspect of social history that they've covered or whatever, and really, in a sense, to challenge myself to try and think about what does the shape of Indian history look like, understood in the whole, in the kind of round. And it's actually an exercise that doesn't get done very much today because of the professionalization of history, as you know. So people just have their own particular perspective or their own particular period. And so for me, it was really venturing into not just decades, but centuries and millennia that I didn't really know or just had very basic knowledge of.
You have a job in academia. Did you worry that colleagues would snipe and say Sunil's becoming a popular historian, or were you just too excited really and thrilled to do it?
Well, it's both. I mean, to some extent, I worried and I'm still aware that this is something that's likely to happen. But I think academics have to break out of the security of just talking to one another. And particularly if you're involved in writing about history or politics, and particularly the history and politics of a country like India today, that is part of a public debate. So there's a kind of responsibility, I think, if you're a scholar of history and politics, to write for a broader audience and to engage with the public debate.
Was there any sense in which Sunil is also AKA Mr. Kate Boo? Was Kate's success with her amazing book in any way a spur to reach out wider?
Look, I mean, Kate is a spur in every respect to me. It's not just the success of her book; it's her. And yeah, I mean, we're always talking about the work we're doing. We're always arguing about what we do. And sure, I mean, seeing the kind of work that she did, which is very much about going out and investigating and then using documents to sort of deepen, to have a dialogue between what she sees in the world and what the documents show. I think that was something that I picked up much more and tried to do with this project. As a historian, one is used to just using documents and books and other kinds of sources. This project, because it was also radio, really took me out into the world. And I've done extensive. I must have traveled thousands of miles across the country, just doing the location recordings and the interviews and so on. So it was a different kind of process to sort of tack between ancient Sanskrit manuscripts in translation, I have to say, and then talking to people in the world. So yes, it was a spur.
Talk a little, before we go and examine the different lives, tell me, I mean, did the idea start off with just doing a big Indian radio history, or was the idea of doing a series of 50 lives already inherent in the commission?
Yeah. No, I think the idea was to try and do an account of Indian history for a broader audience, to make it come alive, really. And when I had an initial discussion, as these things happen over dinner with the BBC commissioning person, I kind of said, you know, I've always been interested in biography as a way of telling the story of Indian history. And so if I were to take this on, I'd like to find a way to tell the story through individual lives. And I think what that allowed me to do is several things. I mean, one, it allowed me to tell stories, but without having to fit those individual stories into a single narrative. You know, a kind of glorious narrative of nationalism, or the rise and fall of dynasties, or even into kind of the periodization that's often used for Indian history, which is the sort of Hindu classical period, the Muslim middle or medieval period, the colonial British modern period. And I wanted to get away from those frames. And so just to take stories, but still be able to tell a connected account. As I said earlier, to give a kind of arc of Indian history. It also allowed me one of the things I wanted to do was to, again, not tell Indian history just through politics, through rulers, or even through social history, but through ideas. And I felt that these lives that I was looking at, these 50 lives, in a sense, incarnated ideas. And that's one of the senses.
Yes, explain the title, Incarnations.
Yeah, and it's importantly not reincarnations, it's incarnations. And so there's several senses in which I intend that title. I mean, one is, as I say, as incarnations of ideas and arguments. And of course, one can't reduce a life to an argument or an idea. But I think each of the 50 lives I've chosen did stand for something, or did come to be seen to stand for something. So in that sense, they incarnated an argument or a theme or an idea in Indian history. There are also incarnations in the sense that the book and the radio series constantly moves between the historical moment of the life and present-day India. So what I was trying to show is how these lives get incarnated in the present, how they still remain sites of contest and argument, and in a way, sort of lightning rods for present-day debates, whether it's about caste, whether it's about religion, whether it's about the gender, the individual. All of these still tend to kind of crystallize around these old lives. And so they're lives that are incarnated in the present, in that sense. And in the final sense in which I use it is a personal sense, which is these are my incarnations. Right. So I'm telling
this. It's very personal. And that gives you license to choose the guys you like. Or the people
exactly.
You like. Yeah.
I mean, it gives me license to choose the lives that I wanted to write about, but also to tell the lives in the way I wanted to. So this is not an encyclopedia. It's not trying to be representative of all of India, nor is each life a kind of mini potted biography. Each life is an argument. It's my view about where that life fits in history and where that life connects to present debates. So it's not like a kind of Wikipedia, you know, this is the basic.
Sure.
It gives you a sense of the life, certainly, but it gives you more a sense of, I think, how it felt to live that life, at least to me. So in that sense, it's incarnations. And just going back to the selection, because it's personal, part of the point of the book is to provoke an argument about, you know, do we have a pantheon of Indian historical figures? Should we have a pantheon? Who might be in it? Why? And I'm hoping that people will get really irritated by the 50 they see in, the ones they see not in there, will fight over why there should be some that are there and some that are not there. So it's not, this isn't attempting to define a canon. In many cases, it's taking canonic lives, but trying to subvert our sense of them slightly. And in many cases, it's bringing in lives which are not really part of the canon. But they're purely my selection, my engagement with them.
The project has a bit of an echo of Neil Macgregor's favourite. Neil Macgregor changed publishing history by doing this extraordinary book where when he took over the British Museum, he'd previously been at the National Gallery, I think. And again, he was taking on a lot of territory that was unfamiliar to him. And so he hit upon this brilliant idea, along with the BBC, of taking 50 objects out of the British Museum, ranging from a little cylinder of cuneiform through to maps of Africa, and so on, and wrote this book that was a radio series called History of the World in, is it 50
in 100 objects.
100 objects. 100 objects. And it was an enormous success, partly, not least, because he's an amazing writer himself and has wonderfully engaging style. When he went about it, I've heard some the gossip in the British Museum was that quite a lot of curators were asked to write sort of first drafts of their most important object, and Neil would then rewrite and spin it. Did you seek a lot of advice from, I mean, there's great areas like mathematics and music, which I don't know, maybe you are a mathematician and a musician, but which may not be your first 11, so to speak.
Well, there's a number of things one could say about that. Now, I'll come back to the objects versus lives issue, because I think that's an interesting one. But yeah, I mean, look, I was venturing into territory, as I said earlier, that I just did not know. So one of the pleasures of the book for me, and there was a lot of unpleasure with the book too, right? But one of the pleasures of it was feeling like I was back at university. You know, really being able to learn about new subjects, whether it was Sanskrit, the Sanskrit grammarian Panini, or you know, the 5th century mathematician Aryabhat, 12th century poets in Canada, you know, all these fields that where there's immense scholarship, and in fact in recent decades there's been a real upsurge of scholarship in many of these fields.
This is one of the joys of writing as a generalist about this country, or even as a reviewer. There is this fantastic production specialist work about everything.
Absolutely, and I think we're actually in the golden age of scholarship, particularly about the earlier periods of Indian history. And so one felt a kind of responsibility to bring that to a wider public and to let that inform how one tells these stories. So, you know, this is a book that owes a huge amount to past and present scholars and their generosity in being part of it. So I interviewed a lot of people, you know, all over the world. In America.
So you weren't just sort of sitting in the library or on a sunbed with a nice big pile of books. You were going out and chatting to people.
Yeah, I was completely. And as I say,
which Neil didn't do, did he? He doesn't have.
There was to some extent. There was some. They drew on sort of other scholars, but as you said, they have an in-house team in the British Museum, so they could provide the kind of expertise to draft these. I didn't have. I was a kind of one-man team, but I did have, you know, research assistants and others who worked with me.
And did you take time off? Did you take a year off university and do this?
I had a bit of time off, but otherwise, you know, it would have been impossible. But just to come back to the objects versus lives thing, I think, you know, one of the things about objects is that they don't speak. So in a sense, you can say things about them in a somewhat more interpretative way. With lives, these are people who left, in some cases, their own words, traces, you know, letters, diaries, etc. So you have to kind of be true to their own voice and their own ideas. So I think it sort of constrains you more when you're in some ways, when you're trying to tell a life, than it is when you're trying to illuminate an object. An object, you can do much more. You can let your imagination, in some ways, play with it much. When many times I wished I was talking about, you know, a gate at Fatehpur Sikri or
rather than Akbar in whatever it is.
Yeah.
2,000 words. I mean, how long?
They range between 2,500 to 3,000 words. Some are a bit longer, but they're all around.
And presumably quite easy to boil down some of the kind of prehistoric figures into 2000 worlds, but terribly difficult to do Nehru in 2000
Well,
worlds.
the joke in some of the early radio programs and even in the essay, I cut the phrase out in the essays, but not much was known about, or there's very little evidence, and in a lot of the scholarship about the early figures, it's one of the things I wanted to do was to sort of demythologize some of these figures in order to rehumanize them. And that meant, using documents, using new sources, using new ways, using archaeology, archaeological discoveries, epigraphic kind of readings, and so on. But take a figure like Kabir, the poet and writer.
Very little is known.
There's 5 things essentially that are known about him. He was born in the weaver caste. He was born in Benares. He was a poet. And very little is known about him. But
do you take a view on his religion? Because again, that's sort of disputed, isn't it?
I don't. That's not. One of the things that I wanted to emphasize in the essay about him was that he was an equal opportunity critic of all religions. Whether it was priests or Muslims or mullahs or pundits or whatever, he attacked them all. So he was a kind of a critic of any orthodoxy. So I think the idea of trying to slot him into one religion or another seems to me an imaginative exercise rather than one based on fact.
And you said before that you were choosing people who's represented, in a sense, live issues.
Yeah.
That you were trying to choose lives which illuminated the present in some way.
Yeah, so the first figure in the book is the person who I think is the first real historical personality in Indian history, which is the Buddha. And the idea of writing about the Buddha in 3,000 words is insane. But one of the things that I was interested in was the curious the disappearance of the Buddha in Indian history and Buddhism. How it kind of flourishes for about 1,000, 1,100 years, and then
India is a Buddhist country. Yeah.
India was a Buddhist country, absolutely. It was a Buddhist country, and then it disappears until the 20th century, really. And then it comes back in this very pointed political incarnation through Ambedkar. So the kind of subterranean current of that history, and then its revival, was one of the things that and that's an example of how a life gets taken out of the ancient past and gets recycled into modern day usage. So the essay on the Buddha actually opens in a slum in Mumbai, amidst people recycling.
Kate slum, or
it's an area around there where I've been spending time and so on, and I was interested. The kind of metaphor that runs through the book in many ways is that of recycling. So in that sense, again, the reincarnation idea that Indian leaders, political figures, all of us, we sift through the past and take what's useful to us, and then use it for our own purposes in present-day arguments and debates. And that's, I think, completely legitimate. I'm not trying to say, as a historian, we shouldn't do that and we should only treat them as sacrosanct historical figures. No, the history is there to fight over. But we should be well informed in those battles, not creating forged letters that are supposedly written by, so-and-so about so-and-so and so forth.
one final, before we actually examine in detail some of these lives, one more question on selection. Did you feel under pressure to have X many women, X many Dalits, not too many Muslims, enough Hindus, enough North, too much South?
I didn't really, again, because I made it a personal selection. I wanted to have the South represented a lot, because I think that there is a tendency to over-focus on the North. Yeah. The question of women is an interesting one, and that was one I really did battle with, because there's no way in which the number of women who figure in the 50 are proportionate to their significance and their presence.
How many, out of interest, how many out of the 50
there,
are
I think there are about six there. There's six. But one thing that was very important to me was not simply to talk about women in Indian history only through the figures of women.
Sure.
So I talk about the issues concerning women in essays that are about men as well. So, you know, whether it's Tagore or whether it's Periyar or whether it's many of these figures where the arguments and ideas about the position of women and their rights and so on run through the book. It's not just that they're ghettoized to the six discussions, six figures of women.
I can see you telling your female colleagues this over the next few weeks when it's aired.
Yeah, no, and I you know, I feel pretty. I mean, I feel pretty comfortable about that because I don't feel comfortable about the sparseness of women overall. But I'll tell you one reason why I kind of faced that was because, you know, I said earlier I wanted to demythologize, to rehumanize, and that meant using sources and evidence and documents. And one of the problems with writing about women before the 19th century really is that the sources are sparse.
We don't know much about.
Yeah, exactly. One is kind of falling back into that. And I didn't, and I wanted to have figures who I, you know, thought do point to kind of deep arguments or fault lines in present-day India. So not kind of vignette stories that were just interesting in themselves.
Out of interest, which were the six women?
So there's Mirabai, there's the Rani of Jhansi, Lakshmibai, there's Annie Besant, there's Amrita Shergill, there's Subbalakshmi, and there's Indira Gandhi.
In 3,000 words.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was really like, you know, having to do something with your arm tied behind your back. I mean, it was a good discipline.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was a good discipline.
So, just to take some at random over the next 20 minutes. So, I've just come out of an amazing session with Kai Miller on the shadow of the slave trade.
Yeah.
And what was interesting to me as a historian of India was how all the discussion of slavery was about the Western Passage, about the transshipment of slaves from West Africa to the Caribbean. And it's often forgotten, I think, even perhaps particularly in India, the scale of the slave interchange between, particularly, I think, Ethiopia and the Deccan.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we forget that the slave trade was a completely global one. And it extended not just, as you say, not just across the Atlantic, but eastwards.
And yet, this figure of Malikamba, who's one we're heading towards, is the exception which proves the rule of how different it was. That he rises to great power himself, and the main irritant for Jahangir.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and provokes this extraordinary painting that Jahangir paints, which is a total fantasy, where Jahangir has Malikamba's skewered head on a spear and is shooting an arrow through his eye, but it never happened. It never happened. But one of the things that I found fascinating about Malikamba is, you know, if you compare him with someone like Shivaji, who is, of course, the great hero for resisting the Mughals, Malikamba did that as well. Yeah. But Malikamba came from slave origins. He was African.
Do you want to read
thank you. Shall I read the? Okay, so thank you. I'll read just the opening of it. And
it's very. I mean, I think it's very interesting how much effect Savarkar actually had on Indian history, because I think he was when I was writing about 1857, one of the most interesting things was how the name Mangal Pandey never appeared in all the documentation in Delhi. No one in Delhi seems to have known anything about. The British knew it and called mutineers generic Pandis. But there's not a single reference to him. And this is this sort of case of this figure in Barrackpore who got sort of raised up. Likewise, Shivaji was of no less concern to the Mughals than Malikamba, who very few people know anything about at all.
Largely because he doesn't fit into the kind of set silos of Indian history. You know, he can't be easily, he's not a Hindu, he doesn't come from that part of the world, etc. I'll just read maybe the opening and a bit of the end, just so that people get a sense of how there's a movement between the present and the past in all of these essays. So, and this is Malikamba, the dark-fated one. It's chapter 17, or essay 17 in the book. And Malikamba lived between 1548 and 1626. Years ago, I managed to get tickets to the first cricket test match to be played in the city of Ahmedabad in Gujarat. Opposing the Indian team was the West Indian team, captained by the peerless Viv Richards. The excitement as the crowd streamed to the new test ground was manic, joyful. But I left the match remembering neither the score nor the individual performances. The reactions of the Ahmedabad spectators, though, that I won't forget. As the West Indians took to the field, loud monkey whoops filled the air, and bananas came raining from the stands. The pelted players, probably the greatest West Indian team in history, stood there in their flannels, stunned. Indians' particular contempt for people of African descent, a racism shared even by Mahatma Gandhi, as evident in his South African years, doesn't get talked about much, which is surely one reason little has changed in the 30-odd years since I watched that troubling match. It's telling that the word still widely used in Hindi to refer to black Africans is Habshi, meaning specifically a dark-skinned slave. Malik Amber was an African slave brought by traders to the Deccan Plateau of central southern India. His story is not often remembered in contemporary India, yet by the end of his life, this young slave had become a power broker, even a kingmaker, a persistent tormentor and nemesis of the vast, powerful Mughal Empire of the north. I'll skip a bit may I read a few more minutes?
Sure, of course, please.
So the standard image of 16th and 17th century slavery is of ships moving west from Africa, their shackled human cargo destined to feed the New World's demand for mass labor in the cotton and tobacco plantations. But the slave economy was a genuinely global one, stretching from America to the Far East. Slaves were also sent eastward across the Indian Ocean to bolster the public and private militias of the Deccan Plateau. The interests that conspired to send the boy born Shapu in Abyssinia to India were rooted in trade, a story also with cotton at its heart. And then it goes on to talk about the sort of economy that drove Malik Amber, that brought him to India, and then how he rose from, this young teenage boy who spoke Arabic, but really became this extremely important figure in the Deccan. And I'll just end.
Just while you're looking for the page, so Malik Amber, for those who don't know, is in the Sultanate of Ahmednagar.
Yes.
Which is in east of Pune.
Yes.
And
yes.
Anyone that saw the amazing show, the Sultans of the Deccan in the Met this summer would have seen this wonderful portrait of Malik Amber.
That's right. Yeah. So just to make this comparison with Shivaji, because they're both roughly in the same period in the same part of India, and that connection with Shivaji is an interesting one. Shivaji is the defining hero of his region, the Hindu warrior who defied the Mughals. And in the Indian nationalist story too, Shivaji was the great resistor against the Muslim invaders. Yet with Malik Amber, we have evidence of someone who even earlier took on the Mughals and whom they could not defeat. He's not a Hindu, he's not a native defending some ancient motherland, he's an Ethiopian opportunist and power entrepreneur. So it turns out that one of the main resistors to Mughal expansion into the south turns out to be an Ethiopian slave. He doesn't fit neatly into any of the standard narratives of Indian history, Hindu, Turkish, Muslim, or European. And that was the kind of figure that kind of interested me to recover.
And what's often forgotten also about these wars in the Deccan is that the armies fighting them were not Central Asian Turks. They were particularly on the attack on Ahmednagar, they were from Bikaner. They were Rajputs.
Yeah.
And so Jahangir was using Rajput armies from here to attack Muslim cities with the black generals in the Deccan. It's much more complicated than people...
Yeah, and it was driven by pragmatic power calculations, not by kind of, religious or even ethnic affiliations. I mean, it was in that sense, they were very secular calculations in the sense of, being pragmatic power ones.
And this is very interesting for art history because when Ahmednagar falls, the libraries from Ahmednagar is taken to Bikaner and totally transforms the painting that's done in Bikaner from that point on, which is heavily influenced by Ahmednagar.
Right.
So there's sort of strange calculations here.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I found fascinating are these interconnections that get set up. I mean, between the lives, but also between how many of these lives sort of overlap, or they're threads that tie them one to the other. And often that's not seen if we treat them purely in terms of regional histories or religious histories at all.
Now, a figure I had never heard of, I'm ashamed to say, until I picked up this book, Basavana, a Kannada poet of the 12th century?
Yes, he was, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I was fascinated by him, and really, this is a man who lived in the 12th century, and who was a poet, a maker of a form called the Vachana, and which was this written not in Sanskrit, but in Kannada, in the vernacular, if you like. And the idea was that it was verse that came out of everyday speech. And he has this wonderful description that, you know, more or less saying, don't write unless you can write with the clarity of a crystal dagger.
Lovely.
That you had to just write in this very honed, sharp way. And they had to be sentences that could be understood by everyone. And that was also because he was an extraordinary social critic of his time. So he was a critic of the caste order. And indeed started, incited essentially a kind of uprising between the upper castes and the lower castes. And
how did you came to him through Ramanujan, or?
Yeah, so I came across him through the translations of the poet and critic A.K. Ramanujan, who, you know, one can be, some scholars are critical of Ramanujan's translations in the sense that they think he modernized too much. And that's possibly true, but he certainly made these words come alive in a way that, for me, is really important.
For anyone in the audience who's not aware of A.K. Ramanujan's translations, they are, I thought, some of the most moving, and that he was himself a poet.
Yeah.
And Songs of Love and War.
Yes, and speaking of Shiva and
Songs of the Drowning, they're extraordinary translations. They're available in the bookshop. And
yeah, they are wonderful, and it's really a way of discovering different voices.
Yeah.
But Basavana, I found was a figure that completely fascinated me, and in the radio program, we use this Carnatic saxophone with his verse, and it's a kind of, for me, it's a very nice combination of a kind of almost like jazz saxophone and this sort of very modernist verse, but it's from the 12th century.
Question I'm sure everyone wanting to know by this stage, is the radio going to be available online here? Yeah,
so the first series of 25, they're all available as podcasts, and they're all downloadable free on the BBC site or by iTunes. And you know, one of the...
Where you'd have to pay for them?
No, it's free.
As well?
It's free on iTunes as well. Yeah. And the second series will come out from the end of February, which is when the book will actually be out in the bookshops. It's not yet in the bookshops, but it'll be out at the beginning of March. So the radio is off. But it also meant that, you know, I was aware that while the broadcast radio was for a British audience, the podcasts were going to be available all over the world. So this question of being able to pitch it for very different audiences was a huge kind of challenge for me. That, you know, how do I assume that a British audience might not know very much about any of these figures, whereas an Indian audience would know something about some of these figures.
There are presumably very few people would know about Basavana.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think...
perhaps in Karnataka.
Yeah, I don't think that many people would know about him. And even, you know, some of my academic friends, even a figure like Malikamba is not that well known. So I think there are figures like that. But then, you know, Gandhi is there, of course. So, you know, one of you say, how does one do these figures?
3,000 words on Gandhi.
Yeah, so that was really, really difficult. But again, I began it in the present day, more or less, and then talk about 2 or 3 aspects of Gandhi's life and practice, which really strike me. One of which is he was this extraordinary user and manipulator of the media. So, you know, when he plans the Dandi March, it's extraordinary to see the meticulous planning that goes into that march. The selection of the other 79 marchers who go with him. He didn't want any other great leaders to overshadow him. He made sure, he told them exactly what to wear. He sent people in advance of the march to all the villages they were stopping in, to assemble the villagers, to clap, and so, to be there when he came in. And then not only that, he got 3 film crews to come with him to film him.
What date is this?
This is 1930, when he does the Salt March. And then
the film crews will be in cinemas. This would be
yes. So this was Pathé, and because he wanted the world to see the cruelty of the British. And then not only that, at strategic moments in the march, he would speed up his walk so that it looked like he was walking really fast, and then he would slow down. And once they'd filmed it, and by the way, the film crews went by car; they didn't march. But when you look at the detail of how he organized these things, you see that this was in a very different way, and for nonviolent and infinitely better purposes, he was using the tools of mass propaganda like Hitler or Mussolini was, in the sense of, how do you get a message with a minimum of words, in his case, to a global audience. So that was...
Back to the 12th century.
Back to the 12th century. You
want to skip?
Yeah, maybe, because the verse is so beautiful. I think people should read this, read the essay. I won't try.
Krishnadevaraya, 177.
Right, okay. So this is about one of the Vijayanagar kings called Krishnadevaraya, who, again, is a fascinating figure because he was he was the last of the kind of great universal emperors of southern India. But he was also a figure who had a very intense interior life, and he wrote.
For your benefit, has fantastic text that you can draw.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, he wrote his own poem, and he was a great patron of some of the greatest Telugu writers. And he also wrote in Telugu, although Telugu was not his mother language.
And a patron of the arts. You go to Chidambaram, there's a wonderful picture of him on one of the doors.
That's right. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And he was the patron of the great Telugu poet Pedana, Alasana Pedana. And so I'll just read the opening and then the end of it, because one of the things that Krishnadevaraya plays with is this business of exercising power but wanting to renounce power, which is, for me, a deep theme in Indian rulership, that you can never be seen to love power too much, even as you exercise it. And it's what some have called the inner conflict of tradition.
And then they do renounce it in the early period and go off and become Jain monks or...
Yeah. So it's this tension between power and authority. That, the warrior has power, but the Brahmin has authority. And how do you try and bring the two together without losing power, but without sort of tainting your authority? So, okay, I'll just read the opening to Krishnadevaraya. The subtitle is Kingship is Strange. Imagine an imperial court in South India at the beginning of the 16th century. The king sits at the center, flanked by women with eyes like blue sapphires, who are cooling the air with yak-tail fans. Seated in front of the king, scholars discuss the fine points of Paninian grammar, atomistic philosophy, and metaphysics. Warriors hold swords darkly glowing in the afternoon light, which filters across the hall, refracting through the jewel crowns of defeated kings as it comes to rest on the king himself. This king ruled over the largest empire ever in South India, and the description of his court comes from his favorite poet, the great Telugu writer Alasani Pedana. The king's capital, built at Hampi in the central Deccan, was called Vijayanagar, the city of victory. His name was Krishnadevaraya, and he had a talent for turning conflict into order. But I'll jump to the ending, because there's a verse that is at the ending which I think tells us something about him. And so he wrote this verse poem called the Amukta Mulyada. And in the Amukta Mulyada, when Krishnadevaraya dramatized these debates about the nature of kingship, who is the best king, about whether it's better to rule or renounce, and in that he's having a debate with himself. Should he be sort of ruling or should he be doing something else? He's turning around in his mind the contradictions and ambivalences of royal life, the inner conflict of tradition. And this, I'll just read a verse that he writes. The king is non-violent, though he kills, chaste, though he has women, truthful, though he lies, ever fasting, though he eats well, a hero, though he uses trickery, rich, though he gives away. Kingship is rather strange. And it's this kind of...
Very nice.
And you know, to find a 16th century man of power reflecting in that way is I think, an astonishing thing.
Very fascinating character. Now, I wasn't surprised, but it's quite a heavy weighting towards the 19th and 20th century. About 2/3 of your figures are...
Yeah, it is, because you know, at the end of the day, while this is a kind of venture into the long past, the long arc of Indian history, the story ultimately that I want to tell is what are the ideas and arguments that have shaped modern India, and particularly shaped modern India as a democracy. What are the resources in the Indian past that we can draw upon? So there is a way in which, you know, it builds to the present, and again, it also goes to sources, and the sources that, in a sense, I could handle, sure. Really. So you're absolutely right. That there is a weightage towards the present, but you know, even showing how those figures from the present are themselves drawing on the ancient past.
And for example, in this way, you use Tagore very cleverly as an argument for...
Yeah, so Tagore, again, you know, what more can one say about him? And for me, what really struck me as important about him is how he's the great voice of individual liberty in 20th century India.
Which is not necessarily how he's remembered in Bengal today.
No. And particularly how he sees individual liberty as founded, freedom as founded in relationships, and above all in love, in the choice of love, in the choice, the individual's ability to choose who they love, something which Tagore actually never could do in his own life, and which he even denied his own children. And I'll just read you the opening of this, again to show you how it moves between the past and the present. In the summer of 2015, I happened to arrive in Washington, D.C., on the afternoon in which the Supreme Court of the United States made same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. By evening, as supporters of the verdict celebrated in streets and parks across the country, the White House glowed in the rainbow colors of the gay pride flag. As exhilarating as that historic moment was, what affected me more was what came afterwards. A law that would have seemed radical a decade earlier settled almost instantly into the normal state of American affairs. Among liberals, political conversations moved on. It seemed to me a testament to the deep roots of individual freedom in the United States. In India, by contrast, a person's freedom to choose the life that he or she prefers is a liberty resting on fairly shaky ground. Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, a relic of British rule that was upheld by the Indian Supreme Court as recently as 2013, decrees that a single act of same-sex love can land you in prison. And the constrictions are not just statutory or only for homosexual relations. That Indians have to use the term love marriage to describe a freely chosen partnership between a man and a woman is a reminder that social and cultural pressures operate across the board to arrange the most intimate of human relationships. And I then go on to you know, I quote Tagore. Tagore says, the history of the growth of freedom, the restless Bengali writer Tagore said, is the history of the perfection of human relationship. And I talk about his stories about love. And if I can just end with the very end of this, the last paragraph of the essay here reads like this. Menaka Guruswamy was one of the lawyers who argued in the Supreme Court against the constitutional legality of that part of the Indian Penal Code that criminalizes consensual gay sex. She lost, and a setback not just to the rights of a minority, but to the Constitution's promise of freedom to every Indian citizen. And I'm quoting her now here in an interview I did with her. If you do not recognize the ability of a human being to freely love, or if you do not recognize the ability of a human being to have freedom of thought and expression, Guruswamy says, then you are doing something to freedom. And there is nothing intrinsically more powerful in the quest for freedom than being able to love whom you want to. It's hard not to think Tagore would agree.
We've got time for maybe one more before we open it to questions. Do you want to do Krishna Menon?
Yeah, okay.
Or
yeah,
no, your
yeah.
choice. I mean,
Or Krishna Menon or Periyar, maybe I could.
Periyar's page 450.
Okay, because that's an idea of how, this issue of
Sure.
the position of women appears in different ways in the book. So, okay, I'll just be quick on this, and I'll just read two paragraphs. This is Periyar. It's called the Sniper of Sacred Cows. Imagine, if you will, I'll start that again. Imagine, if you will, that Indian women were a country unto themselves, the Women's Republic of India. At around 600 million people, the new state would be the world's third largest, a little smaller than the misruled territory of male India. On the 2014 UN Human Development Index, it would rank behind Myanmar and Rwanda. Now home in on the mean years of schooling, our Democratic Republic of Indian females would be at 3.2 years neck and neck with Mozambique. As for per capita inflation-adjusted income, hold on to your hat as Ivory Coast and Papua New Guinea leave our new nation behind in the dust. It's sobering to see what a tripling of India's GDP since 2000 has not done for its women. And I then go on to talk about how in South India, actually the position of women is much, much better than it is in North India, in all respects. Participation in the labor force.
Kerala.
Well, Tamil Nadu as well, particularly. And one of the things I think behind that has been the arguments of figures like Periyar, who from the late 20s onwards were arguing about contraception, about the equality of women, about what he called self-respect marriages, and really advancing the interests of women, not just to win an election, but for 20, 30 years he advocated this cause, and it helped, I think, to change the culture, which has actually improved the life prospects of women there.
Are there any essays in here that you think are going to get you into trouble? Are you anxious about... Just to alert the gentlemen of the press before...
As I said, it's an invitation to an argument.
On that note, please give a loud round of applause, ladies and gentlemen, for
Thank you.
Sunil Khilnani. We have time for questions, so please, hand up here, straight away.
Good afternoon, sirs. Sir, of the several lives you've explored in the series, three that stand out for me are Aryabhatta, Bhaskara and Panini, who, though deeply steeped in spirituality and mysticism, really exemplified rational thinking in the BC era. So my question is, in today's times of political appropriation, where frankly a number of hilarious claims are being made about the capacities of ancient Indians, what has your journey through these lives taught you about the continuous tradition of scientific thinking and rational thought in India? I'd love to know both your answers actually. And quick note, Birsa Munda's story was the most mind-blowing one. Wow, what a story.
How come you've seen it, incidentally?
That's the first 25, which are on podcasts.
Are on podcast already, you've been listening to them. So people here can download them now?
Yeah, they can download them. But do read the essays.
Which are slightly different, are they?
Yeah, they're
longer?
extended. Yeah, they're longer and more detailed. Well, if I should, I just?
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing to say is the importance of historical truth, and I think that's there implicit in what you just said. That people make up these fantastical stories about them, as they're doing at the moment about letters by Nehru, about Bose and so on. So I think, in looking at these figures in the past, while I say these are my interpretations, I've always tried to be true to the record and true to the sources. And I think that's really, really important, because if you look at the nature of our public debate, much of the use of these lives is completely fast and loose. And I think, we need to re-inform ourselves in order to kind of use these lives to kind of regenerate ourselves, really. And so that is absolutely, and the Panini, who you mentioned, and Aryabhatta, yes, I mean, these are absolutely figures committed to rational thought, and in the case of Panini particularly, I mean, extraordinary sort of logical, computational, algorithmic mind. And Aryabhatta also. And one of the things is remarkable about these figures, particularly in the case of Panini, is he's doing this in his mind. It's not even written down. And I interviewed a man called Paul Kiparsky, who's a professor of linguistics at Stanford, a student of Chomsky's, and he was saying that they, with Chomsky in the early 60s, they were inventing generative grammar, and when they read Panini, they realized that he'd done this 2,500 years ago, and it completely sort of blew their minds, really. And yes, I mean, these.
Can you say a little bit more about Aryabhatta, because he's such a fascinating figure?
Yeah, so Aryabhatta, and I don't talk about Bhaskara. I could have done, but I talk about Ramanujan in the 20th century, but that's not out yet. So Aryabhatta is this very playful mathematician of the sort of 6th century, 6th century. And one of the things is we understand figures like him much better now because there's been this flowering in the study of Sanskrit mathematics. And he was a kind of, well, certainly in terms of astronomy, was extremely important. And in terms of, plotting the movement of the Earth and the Sun. And also with pi, he was this kind of brilliant, playful mathematician. There was a school after him, and indeed there's a second Aryabhatta later in Kerala. But again, not that much is known about him.
Not much known about Aryabhatta? I'm not going to answer your question because it's his show, this one. But the lady in the white khadi.
Yeah, hi. I look forward to reading the book. I just want to know, we know the 6 women who have made it into the book. Can you share some of the women who didn't make it?
I'd be more interested if you could share those, actually. I mean, there were figures, for example, figures from the Mughal period who, Nur Jahan, but
Razia Sultan?
I thought about her very hard, and she almost made it into the book. Nur Jahan, I didn't want to do too many Mughals, and Akbar is there, and sort of Darashikoh is there, and Nur Jahan, it's an interesting story, but I didn't know how much I could use it to talk about the present day issues.
Sure.
So there were figures like that for whom we have sources, but one of the things that strikes me about even the women figures that we do celebrate is that they all get turned into these mythic, heroic figures, like Lakshmi Bai and so on. And so I wanted to kind of say, we're denying them their extraordinariness by not seeing them as human beings. It's only if we see them as human beings that we really see how extraordinary they are. And so that's what I was trying to do with some of these figures. And in the case of Subbalakshmi, there's another example of a woman who is incredibly determined, energetic, sort of disruptive woman who pursues her own interests and then suppresses it all in order to make her career. And that seems to be a great tragedy, that she had to actually suppress the very things that made her such an extraordinary person in order to build a great career. And so I think, we need them to be human examples in order to inspire young women and girls today.
At the back there, in the corner, hand right up. Yes, you, sir. Yes, you. Looking at the one behind, maybe next question to you with the beard.
You made a reference to a letter that was published today as forged, quote unquote. Now,
you can remove the quotes. It is a fraud.
It is
as far as I'm concerned, yes.
Well, I don't know. It's such a debatable topic in India. I would like to know from you, as a historian, do you think that the death of Subash Chandra Bose is settled beyond doubt, or is there any reasonable question about it?
Well, first of all, even by natural attrition, he would be dead today. But the second point is that, yes, as a historian, I do believe that there's sufficient evidence and documented evidence for us to be able to say with confidence that Subash Chandra Bose died around the end of the Second World War.
In the plane crash?
Yes, as far that's certainly, to my knowledge, that's a certain thing that I would stand by. Yeah. Is he there? Yes, he is there. He is there, and you know, it seems to me he is a figure of immense.
Did you have to be careful to include a certain number of Bengalis? Or
Look, that's again, it's an invitation to be. The one area that I really felt
outrage in Calcutta.
the one area that I felt I didn't have properly there, and I would have liked to have had, is the Northeast. Because you know, again, documentation was really bad. But just coming back to Bose, I mean, I think, you know, Bose is a figure of a bravura figure, extraordinarily determined, and a figure of massive political misjudgment. I think he's a figure who you know, wanted to do the right thing, but in completely the wrong way. And so I'm deeply skeptical of the kind of attempt to revive him as this great hero for modern day India, because as a way of judging political choices, I think he was deeply mistaken. And you know, that's one of the things I argue in the essay. But interestingly, I think his willingness to ally with any kind of hard power, Hitler, Hirohito, at the end of his life, the Soviets he was going to, it became a kind of almost vaccination for post-independence India not to ally with any hard power. So in a curious way, Bose's alignment helped to kind of found non-alignment in Indian politics.
Out of interest, as a measure of how things are changing in the country at the moment, I was in the National Archives this week working away, and everything was going very slow because they're mounting a massive exhibition of Subhash Chandra Bose in the place where there was previously an exhibition called the Gandhis.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, this is just part of his battle and contest over figures from the past, yeah.
Last question.
No, this gentleman with the beard and then this one. You don't have a beard, madam.
Even in this